Members, we are going to call the November 13th meeting of the Legislative Audit Commission to order. This meeting is held according to the rules that have been adopted in the House and the Senate for virtual meetings. It is going to be a full agenda for recording purposes. We're having some difficulty live streaming it, but we are recording it for future play by the public. Legislative audit commissions generally do not take testimony from the public anyway, but the meeting will occur and we have a full agenda today. And so we'll start, the agenda has been posted. Is that correct, Ms. Randall? We'll start with item number 1, finalizing the performance reviews of the legislative auditor and the deputy legislative auditor. And I would go first to Michelle Weber to describe the process, and then Senator Cran on how we did this. So Ms. Weber.
Mr. Chair and members, my name is Michelle Weber and I'm the Executive Director of the Legislative Coordinating Commission. I was asked by the Executive Committee to work in partnership with Tom Bodern from the Senate and Patrick McCormick from the House to develop a process and structure for conducting the performance review of Jim Nobles as the legislative auditor based on the policy that had been adopted by the full commission. We developed a timeline to achieve the performance review by November 15th, which was the anniversary date. And then it included multiple components. It included a self-assessment by Mr. Nobles, the review of Ms. Randall as the deputy auditor, and then also included interviews that were conducted by Senator Kiffmeyer and Representative Liebling of staff within the Office of the Legislative Auditor, as well as an agency that had received both a program evaluation and a financial audit review during the review period, which encompassed the last year. In addition to that, to those things, Representative Hansen and Senator Cran completed a template performance review form that evaluated the legislative auditor on multiple criteria and factors. So with that, I will stand for any questions.
Members, are there any questions of Ms. Weber? Nope. Move to Senator Cran to explain the evaluation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so with that, I thank you, Michelle, for covering the process. And this is new, and so we really appreciate your help in making sure that, one, the definition of the entire process, and then two, your office's assistance in making sure we preserve the anonymity and the privacy necessary to conduct these interviews, or the interviews, as well as the overall assessment and the reviews. And so I think everybody has a pretty positive overview of the process, even though it's the first go around. We'll improve it and get better. And then from the interview perspective, I want to thank Senator Kiffmeyer and Representative Liebling. They did the agency interviews and the personnel interviews, and we appreciate that. The feedback. They actually did volunteer, and so we do appreciate it. they weren't the ones last standing in the line. But we took that information from the agencies, and then we went through the performance review with Mr. Nobles. And when we looked through it, of course, the highlights come out that Mr. Nobles runs a very good ship here for us in the legislative body. It's deemed, and we agree that he exceeds expectations from the perspective of the operation of the office. And I think the entire process, when we look at the staff reviews and the interviews and the staff performance, Ms. Randall and those that serve under Mr. Nobles, I think we can all be proud in the agencies he's created, and everybody's kind of a reflection of the standards in which Jim sets. The length in which he goes to make sure that the nonpartisan nature of that agency is maintained is extraordinary. I don't think most consider all the little things that he has to do on a daily basis, and then make sure his staff understands the importance to maintain that for them to function at their highest level. And I think that's why this agency has ultimately become an extremely well-respected business unit, the reflection of the leader, and then one of the most valuable pieces of state government to the legislative body, and thus the citizens of Minnesota that allow us to function. And so with that, this is our first go about. I appreciate that we put together some policies, some structures, and some standards for those that follow us. And then in addition to me, it's the kickoff of the second part of our conversation is we as the Legislative Audit Commission should be the ones that drive and make sure that we're fully integrated and making sure to map out what is the future of the Legislative Audit Commission and its activities and work for the next calendar year. And so I'm very glad that that's where we're at today. And with that, Mr. Chair, I don't think I have any other comments.
Senator Rest has a question. Senator Rest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, it's more of a comment, and I just want to remind members that when we refer to and address members of the staff, that we do not use their first names, that we refer to them as Mr. and Ms., and that we do that as a consistent practice. I know it doesn't mean any disrespect, but we should not be using first names when we address members of the staff, or the legislative auditor's staff, or certainly not one another. So just a reminder of what the best practices are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Members, any other questions for either Ms. Weber or Senator Cran? I'd like to give Mr. Nobles a few moments to respond to the review.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Am I being heard?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman. I really appreciate the work that both of you did and other members of the commission to set up this process. And I appreciate the comments that were made. But I just want to remind everybody, I don't think you necessarily need reminding, but for those who may be listening or viewing this later, this is a partnership between nonpartisan staff and legislators. And without that partnership, we really cannot be effective. So I appreciate the comments made about me being the head of this office. But, you know, I was here kind of from the beginning when there were legislators long ago who had the idea of setting this office up. And so it exists because legislators wanted it and wanted it to be nonpartisan. And frankly, we need to always do everything we can in this office to maintain that kind of reputation for this office by the work that we do. But we also must always recognize the role of the legislature in supporting this function. And I certainly understand that that doesn't mean that you always agree with our reports or even necessarily what we say about departments or issues or programs. But what we do hope is that by the work we do, we can sustain your support for this function. And I think I would just end on this, and I think you always need to keep us accountable, and I think this performance review is exactly what that was. And in addition to the nice comments that were made by Senator Cran and others, they also gave me some good insight and some action on some areas where we need to strengthen. And I take that very seriously, and we will put those into effect. So thank you very much for the process, and I look forward to working with the commission going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Nobles, and thank you for your work. Members, we do not need to take a vote on this. The official documentation that goes into the file is Mr. Nobles exceeds expectations. And with that, then we would move to Mr. Nobles' evaluation of the Deputy Legislative Auditor.
And thank you. And having deputies carry out many of the functions in the Program Evaluation Division and the Financial Audit Division is absolutely essential. I started as a deputy of the Program Evaluation Division, and then over the years, After becoming legislative auditor and losing some deputies, I tried to go back and fulfill those functions of a deputy. Actually, it's a lot more hard, it's a lot more challenging and difficult to be the deputy than to be the legislative auditor, because you not only have to do the functions that are very challenging, but you have to put up with me or whoever else is the legislative auditor. And that is not always easy. So I really appreciate the work of Judy Randall. She has been with this office for a long time, worked her way up from the very beginning, managed projects, worked on projects. And when there was a vacancy to fulfill, I really felt like she was the right person for that job. And I think that's been proven to be a good judgment on my part. So she excels in every aspect of her responsibilities, and I thank her for her work.
And members, I should note that we are now streaming live on Facebook, that the live feed is occurring and for those just joining us, we had some technical difficulties at the beginning, and that portion of the meeting is recorded for available viewing. Are there any questions of Mr. Nobles regarding Ms. Randall's review? Ms. Randall, would you like to comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall. I'm Deputy Legislative Auditor for OLA's Program Evaluation Division. I just simply thank you for the opportunity to continue in this position. I think the work OLA does is really important, and as Mr. Noble said, we couldn't do it without a close partnership with all of you. So I'm just looking forward to continuing that that relationship and the work that OLA does. So I have nothing more to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Members, any questions of Ms. Randall? Ms. Randall, thank you for your work. Next, Mr. Nobles, we'll move to an action item. This is item number 2 on the agenda, considering approval of the appointment of the Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Financial Audit Division, Ms. Lori Layson.
And again, thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission. And it's a good segue when I just talked about the work of the Deputy for the Program Evaluation Division and the work that Ms. Randall does. And so we've been without a deputy for the Financial Audit Division for several months when Chris Boozy decided to leave that position. And so I have turned to the directors and other staff within the division, and they have carried on in a very excellent way. But I simply know from my experience that I could not provide them with all of the time and leadership and guidance that they need. We need a full-time qualified deputy for the Financial Audit Division. And again, I was very fortunate to look through the list of possibilities and see Lori Layson, who I've worked with for many years. She's fully qualified. She is a CPA. She has many years of experience in state government and worked her way up through all of the various positions in the Office of Legislative Auditor. And she also comes with experience from the private nonprofit sector. So I really appreciate her willingness to take on this difficult and challenging job. And so I ask for your confirmation of my appointment of her. And sure that you'll want to hear from Ms. Layson as well. And I will certainly be willing to answer any questions that you might have of me. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
And members, Ms. Layson's letter of application and resume are posted and should be available in your file. I'm searching for a motion to approve so we could get this on the
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve this appointment.
Senator S. moves. Ms. Layson, would you like to respond?
Mr. Chair, members, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Well, I do want to thank Mr. Nobles and everyone for the opportunity to serve in this role. I do want to continue to promote accountability and strengthen legislative oversight. We'll continue to focus on our financial statement audits, our internal control compliance audits, and our special reviews. with the potential to discontinue our audit of the federal funds. Our goal would be for FAD to increase the depth, the coverage, and the frequency of our audits in the internal control and compliance and special reviews, which I believe provides an increase in the overall value of the work that we do for the legislature, for the state agencies, and for the public. Thank you.
Members, are there any questions for Ms. Lyson? Any questions? See none, we'll proceed to vote. Because this is a virtual meeting, we will need to take a roll call. Ms. Gilba will take the roll.
Ms. Gilb, are you there? We can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I was having trouble getting it unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, roll call begins. Senator Benson. I think she might be absent. Is that correct? Representative Bernardi.
Present.
And your vote?
Oh, I'm sorry. Aye.
Representative Erickson.
Aye.
Senator Friends.
Aye.
Representative Hansen.
Aye.
Senator Kiffmeyer.
Aye.
Senator Klein.
Aye. Aye.
Just to confirm, that was Senator Klein responding?
Yes.
Thank you. Senator Coran.
Aye.
Representative Liebling.
Aye.
Representative Pearson.
Aye.
Representative Quam.
Aye.
And Senator Rest.
Aye.
The ayes have it.
Congratulations, Ms. Lice. You are the new Deputy Auditor for the Financial Audit Division. Welcome. We're clapping virtually.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Nobles.
I just want to add a comment that Ms. Lyson has, effectively been serving in a kind of acting role for the last several weeks before her confirmation. And so she's had to deal with many of the challenges and issues that come up and that end up on the deputy's desk. And so I did confirm just shortly before the meeting that she still wanted the job. And that, it is a challenging position. So again, I just want to thank her for her willingness to take that important leadership position in this office.
And this would be a good moment to extend our thank you to all of the staff of the Audit Commission. These are difficult times with COVID-19, and we're doing things differently than we've ever done before. So we want you to extend our thank you for all of the staff for the work that they do on behalf of the people of Minnesota.
We will do that, Mr. Chairman, and thank you.
Next, members, we will go to Minnesota Management and Budget regarding the OLA's proposal for the single audit. Commissioner Farrell and Commissioner Hallstrom, are you here?
This is Eric Hallstrom. Can you hear me, Chair?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. And let me just confirm Ms. Farrell is on.
I am on.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. For the record, my name is Eric Hallstrom, one of 2 deputy commissioners at Minnesota Management and Budget. First off, congratulations to Ms. Lyson on the promotion. We'll look forward to continuing to work with you and have a good relationship. And appreciate the opportunity to be here to just share a few thoughts from MMB's perspective on some of the changes under discussion regarding the single audit. I will not spend a lot of time going through too much detail. I know Commissioner Showalter has had a chance to connect with a few of you to, and I again apologize he was not able to be here today, but just to offer, at a very general high level perspective, the single audit is a requirement, but it is not a requirement that the legislative auditor's office do the single audit. And so I think at a very high level, this is really a matter of just coordinating to ensure that important required work is done, and that, from our standpoint, that we have the resources necessary to obtain and complete those requirements in a timely and thorough fashion. Let's see, I know that there's a mix of experience between other states on whether state auditor, legislative auditor, or external CPA firm. You do see a mix between the way that it's approached, and so there's no one magic way to accomplish it. I think that from our standpoint, and this I may hand things off to Commissioner Farrell if there are questions, but there are some complexities around the financing component as it works right now, and so I will probably go about as deep as I can go. But we currently are collecting from agencies through our statewide indirect cost allocation plan the appropriate costs that their funds, federal funds, can support this overhead work. That money goes into the general fund right now as a non-dedicated receipt. And so essentially to repurpose the funds that are currently collected from agencies to pay for single audit work does carry a general fund cost, essentially to use those funds for to pay for an audit from a third party would require repurposing funds that are currently deposited into the general fund once collected. And so let me pause there and just offer up any opportunities to ask questions or clarifications, and maybe allow Ms. Farrell to go into more detail if you would like to understand that process a little bit more.
Senator Curran has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Commissioner Hallstrom. What do we know? What is that dollar amount of the agencies or statewide for the single audit? We know the feds provide that funding, and thus you just described what we did with it. What is that dollar amount?
Commissioner Hallstrom or Commissioner Farrell?
I am going to have Ms. Farrell field this one.
Commissioner Farrell.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. The costs do fluctuate year to year based on what the federal requirements are from year to year. So the last fiscal year, the cost was about $1.8 million of costs that were incurred by the Office of Legislative Auditor. So those costs then get factored into our annual statewide indirect cost plan and allocated back to those agencies who have the federal programs that were audited as part of the single audit. So they are paying, for the most part, those agencies are paying those through statewide indirect costs, and the funds go back to the general fund. And it's basically an offset, or trying to offset some of those costs that were appropriated to the legislative auditor. Now, I say mostly because there are certain instances where federal programs consider indirect costs to be not allowable. So those specific programs may be exempt from paying their share of this cost through an indirect cost plan. But I believe if this was changed to more of a direct billing to those agencies for their share of those costs, that would become an allowable expenditure. And as far as
Thank
the
you.
costs, they've ranged, fiscal year 17 was about 1.2 million. Fiscal 18 was a little over $1 million. Fiscal year 19 was a little over $1 million. And then, as I said, fiscal year 20 was higher at almost 1.8.
Senator Cran, did you have a follow-up?
No, thank you, Vic, or Chair.
Representative Liebling.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have to confess, I find this very confusing. So if you could just, either Ms. Farrell or Mr. Hallstrom, walk me through this in a really simple way. And here's my confusion. It sounds to me like we're getting federal money. Part of that federal money is designated by the feds for auditing purposes. That money is going to the agencies that it's appropriated to through however we're doing that. And they're spending it. And then the money on whatever, and then the money to audit is coming out of the OLA's budget, but none of the federal funds to do that work are directed to the OLA's budget. So I don't know, maybe if you could, and I know you, I know there was more there that I didn't quite understand. So if you could, let's take a really simple example. Talk about, for those of us who are not auditors and, we're struggling to understand the really complicated state financing. So if we get $100 from the feds to do some kind of work in an agency, some portion of that is expected by the feds to go toward auditing to make sure the money is appropriately used. So if using an example like that, could you kind of walk us through what's happening now? And, because I'm frankly, it's a little shocking to be told we're doing this work now with the OLA, but we're going to have to pay for it out of the general fund, even though the feds are giving us the money to do the work. It just doesn't compute fully.
So the current, Mr. Chair, the current process is there is a direct.
Commissioner Farrell, I think you froze.
Mr. Chair, let me give 1 second to see if Cindy can get back online. I guarantee she will do a better job of walking you through this than I will. So I want to make sure that we give her a chance. If her internet is acting up, I will do my best.
I hope it wasn't the question.
This was not a strategy, Mr. Chair.
Have we lost her?
Mr. Chair, I don't know if Commissioner Farrell can hear us, but if she can, sometimes it helps to turn off the camera. So I'm just throwing that out into the universe as a hope that she'll turn off her camera and then we'll be able to hear her. Oh, maybe it worked.
Commissioner Farrell. Maybe. Commissioner Hallstrom. Commissioner Farrell.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a message. So I'll do my best. Some of this has to do with timing because we are essentially accounting for the hours that the legislative auditor's office will put into the single audit and appropriating that in advance. Subsequently, those audits lag by some period of time, and then by the time that the allocation methodology goes out to our state agencies, they then provide those, essentially respond to their bills for things like statewide systems as well as the indirect costs. And for indirect costs, those it's offset by going back into the general fund. So essentially you're bringing it back around from the general fund and back to the general fund, but they are federal, you're right, they're federal dollars. So a given agency gets an appropriation to use federal resources and then pays for, at the end of that process, the cost associated with the actual hours that were invested in the audit of that federal program. But that is long after the legislatures had to make a choice about appropriating the budget for the legislative auditor's office. And so I'm not going to attempt to describe with specificity the SWACAP or the statewide cost allocation process, because Cindy will do a better job with that. And if she can't get back on, we'll reconnect and make sure that you understand it. But a big function of the challenge is the lag time in between the program that's being audited and the audit itself, the single audit itself.
Representative Liebling.
So money is not being set aside then. When the money comes in from the feds, one would think that it would be, okay, a portion of this $100, you know, $1 of it is for auditing, $2 of it are for some other kind of costs, right? And then the other 97 are for the program, whatever. And that's not really how it's done. We don't set aside that money. So that's what I'm kind of understanding. And the problem is now it seems like there's not really, I don't know, you know, in my legislative career, I came into this without any fiscal background or anything like that. And I have to say, sometimes I think if things are so complicated that people of ordinary intelligence can't understand them, that there is a problem there. And, you know, ordinary people of ordinary intelligence with some effort can't understand them, right? I know that the world is complicated, but I do think this might be crying out for simplification and clarification. But I would love to hear Ms. Farrell, you know, what she has to add, because I'm still, I don't know, I don't want to ask all the questions here, but I don't know, do other members feel like they understand this a whole lot better than I do? Or am I, you know, if I'm the outlier, I'll give up here, but.
Could I respond to something, Mr. Chair? I agree that it is complicated, and it oftentimes feels more complicated than it needs to be. In conversation about how we might be able to structure an alternative approach going forward, I know that Commissioner Showalter, I think, talked a little bit with Senator Kiffmeyer about setting up a special revenue fund that, you know, maybe has the value of, you know, bringing a little bit more simplicity or understandability to this process. It might functionally do largely what we're already doing. It just might be a way to do it in a way that has a little bit more, it's easier to explain, it's easier for a person who's not a financial accounting whiz to sort of follow it. So I think there's a lot of merit in you know, adopting a approach going forward that, you know, tries to make it a little bit easier to digest. And at the same time, I'm a big fan of maximizing our federal resources and making sure that, you know, and that's part of our job, is to squeeze every dollar that we can out. And so sometimes complexity is the trade-off to you know, maximizing that value. And so I don't want to, complexity is not worth it unless it has a value associated with it.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Nobles.
Might I just add, and I agree, Representative Liebling, and I think what, and you wouldn't have said this, but I will, the problem is even greater because people with extraordinary intelligence, way beyond the norm of average people, like yourself don't understand it. And I know many people in our own office who are auditors and accountants say, boy, there are probably only 3 people who really understand how this all works. Now, I think one of the side benefits of what we're proposing is that it will become simpler, because now some entity, some CPA firm will bill the state, and you will know, because there will be invoices and billing, and then you will know where the money came from to pay that bill, and it will come out of the federal funds. And it's probably be a good idea if there is a dedicated account for that. I mean, part of the situation that was created was that we never billed the executive branch for the work we were doing. We didn't bill any agency. We didn't bill the federal government. We just absorbed all of that work within the resources that you gave us. And frankly, there was never originally any accounting for how much that should be from the general fund to OLA for that work. It's sort of like when the legacy amendment passed. We took on a lot more audit responsibility and work, but we didn't get any additional appropriation for that work, and we don't bill for it. So I think, although I'm comfortable with the way we've worked our budget, going to the legislature and asking for a general fund appropriation, it does create this burden on the general fund that is somehow then, as was described, magically sort of reimbursed through federal funds. And that is the complexity. But that complexity, as I say, will not be there once MMB hires a CPA firm to do this work, or some other entity. It's got to be some audit organization that has the independence and the capability of doing it. And they keep track of, exactly the number of hours that go into it. They submit a bill, and that money is going to come from the federal funds, I assume, not the general fund, if this dedicated account of federal money is created.
Mr. Chair, I have my hand raised as well.
Yep. It was, Representative Liebling, were you done? Can we move on? Senator Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Mr. Noble's comments are very, very instructive in the sense that the OLA took on this work without additional compensation for the work. Being grateful for all those years of doing that, but it has come time to end it. And I think the way to do that, I think the federally dedicated account is one way to make it more transparent. But the way it's being done right now is not transparent. I don't think it passes the test of a regular citizen. And I think whatever happens, just so we recognize that the OLA has done its work for a long time, but I think it is time for us to be honest about how that is funded, and whether it's a dedicated revenue pot, and then it's an executive branch function right now for them to do this federal audit and to pay for it. And those dollars should be able to be tracked from federal government to that audit, to all that billing. And I think it's time for that to happen, and that funding is there. And I hope that that will start shortly, or in the next legislative session, that we can make that more specific. And I also appreciate what Mr. Noble said in regards to having an outside entity, a non-government entity that would have the depth and skills. And believe me, there are plenty of them out there as a resource for this. There is no lack of them that have that capability and would be grateful for the work. And it is time to go that direction. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Quam.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I still think that there may be occasions where the legislative auditor would be, in special cases, working on some of this. I'd like to find out who might be working on legislation to generate the special account where the administrative audit and all of the all of the overhead funds would go into and be dispersed, because I'd like to make sure there's a reconciliation that's run at least quarterly on that, and the transparency. I want to avoid the few occasions where we've had the federal government come in, and most instances have been in the HHS type things, and have clawed back because the state either didn't have appropriate or good enough records, or they felt that maybe we had not done it according to their wishes. So offline, it might be nice to communicate who's working on this legislation to set up, that special account, or some of that additional detail. Thank you.
Representative Quam, if you look ahead on the agenda, and I think it's in our packet, there is a housekeeping bill that I think has a general discussion on the transfer. And I think Mr. Nobles and Ms. Randall have been, Ms. Lyson have been taking notes here during your question on some of that. I have a question for Commissioner Hallstrom. So in terms of examples of what can be done, currently we have the CARES Act funding. How is that contracted out? I mean, how have we, was that dealt with a little differently than our traditional funds?
Yes, I suppose I should start by, thank you, Mr. Chair. I should start by just acknowledging that there are more than one stream of CARES Act funds, but the ones that we are spending the most time thinking about are those in the Coronavirus Relief Fund. It has some unique attributes to it. It's not treated in all respects like a normal federal grant. It has certain requirements that is statutorily adhere to the CRF dollars. But again, there are other CARES Act dollars that have flown through, particularly in the public health space. At the moment, we are planning to use the services of the state auditor's office to do the audit on the CRF for both FY20 and 21. We've submitted requests to through the LCRC process, the LAC process, requesting authority to use it's a small portion of the CRF dollars to pay for that portion of the single audit. So even though the Legislative Auditor's Office will be doing the larger single audit for FY20, the component that relates to the CRF will be done by the state auditor. Is that the nature of the question? I can go into more detail, or I think Commissioner Farrell's back on. So if we have additional questions that we might want to get into, might have that assistance as well.
That answered my question. Senator Kiffmeyer, your hand is still up. Is that an additional question, or?
Yes, it is, Mr. Chair. And so I want to put it on the record at this time that one of the things, and I've shared this with Mr. Hallstrom and Ms. Farrell as well, I believe was on at that time, is that I do not believe, and I know maybe it has done so in other states and we can get all kinds of information, but especially when it comes to the CARES Act money, I really think this should be also into a non-government auditing firm. There are many of them that can do an excellent job. I think this is very sensitive, and it is better that we don't have a state government entity that is in the situation right now of almost auditing its own self, executive branch and the state auditor and so on. So generally the rules of auditing is you go outside of that area. So the state auditor audits local government, the legislative auditor generally does executive branch auditing and things like that. So especially when it comes to CARES Act money, I've expressed my objection to this, that instead this project should be given out to a non-government CPA firm.
We have a lot of blue hands. Senator Rest, then Senator Friends, and then Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to state that I thoroughly disagree with the opinion just expressed by Senator Kiffmeyer, the state auditor, already does single audits for the local governments and does so in with the highest standards. I think that is a very appropriate function and activity, and they have the experience and expertise. And I don't see it as any kind of conflict, and it's not necessary to require that private CPA firms be used. It might at some point be seen to need that extra help, but I certainly don't agree that it's inappropriate in any way or manner that the state auditor working with the MMB conducts a single audit for the federal funds, just as it does single audits for local governments now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Friends.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I would like to largely echo Senator Rest's comments. I think the legislative auditor functions that we're talking about shifting, I'm a big fan of legislative auditor, but as we talk about the single audit, as we look at the three options in the materials, the legislative auditor does all single audits jointly with an outside firm, or all outside firms do all. The least popular option is the CPA firm conducting all of the single audits. I think the best approach is the approach where the Minnesota Auditor's Office handles it. And I have always had reservations about privatization of these functions. And with that, I'll just say, for the record, my feeling is very much like Senator Rest. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Liebling.
Well, third vote for that view. That is exactly why I raised my hand also. And I think that embedded in that concern about conflict of interest is sort of the false idea that everything that's government is all one thing. The OLA is government. You know, his function is to audit government, but we don't say, oh my God, he has a conflict of interest. He can't audit government. We're talking about government funds that are coming from the federal government to the state government. And we have a branch that is independent. The state auditor is independently elected. Now, she may be the same party as the governor, but that doesn't make her any less independent. She answers to the taxpayers and the voters who elect her and wants to do a good job for them. So I don't really find this to be a conflict at all. And I would feel very comfortable with that office taking over that duty.
Representative Bernardi.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to also share my support for what my colleagues right before me were saying as well, especially what Representative Liebling commented on, and that's what I was going to share too, is the legislative auditor is elected and they are highly held accountable to the public, and they do a good job, and that's what I think that we should be supporting and moving forward with.
I see 3 hands still up. Are those more comments, or is that?
Mr. Chair, yes.
Senator Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I appreciate listening to the others and what they're saying here, but just to remind you that when the state auditor who is elected, not the legislative auditor, when the state auditor is elected, their main job is to do local governments. It's outside of the state level, it's into the local government level. And one of the key points of auditing is outside, coming from the outside. And so the state auditor is on a state level in the state executive branch overall. And so my issue was not government to government. My issue was separation of duties, separation of oversight, so that you don't have too cozy. You need an arm's length, you need something more. And I'm not convinced that on an executive branch level, constitutional officers closely related as they are right now in many of their common duties in a variety of ways. But I just think that it would be better to come from the outside. And I will stand by that, but I appreciate hearing everybody's perspective. I just wanted to clarify the points that I had made. Thank you.
And Senator Rest and Representative Bernardi's hands are still up. Representative Bernardi, no. Okay.
Mine's down. Excuse me for not doing that. I'm sorry.
No problem. And so members, I just circling back to where we started, I think there was agreement that the Office of Legislative Auditor cannot continue with the status quo the way it is. That the single audit is taking up a great amount of time and adding more time, and that its source of funding or reimbursement is ambiguous at best. So it appears where the differences are on who should do it. That's a different question than what we should do as the commission. Senator Cram.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to follow up on your comments as well as on looking at the single audit, it being the largest consumer of resources within the Office of the Legislative Auditor. To me, it's extremely important that we don't know what the future holds on exactly how we go about this, but we do know today that I believe the head count was some 30 full-time staff members for 6 months out of the year, and some 15 other members. I'm sorry, 30 members total, 15 then full-time, and another 15 members pulled from other activities, vital activities from throughout the other state agencies. And so I think this is originally sold as, Mr. Noble's proposal on the single audit. I would argue otherwise, that I think that it's the Legislative Audit Commission desire to look at and make sure that we have those resources pointed to the highest value activities that are needed. And we've not been able to get to those things. When we're pulling some 30 full-time staff, and when each one of those who perform that single audit tell us that it doesn't utilize their skills and abilities to the greatest extent, that leads me to say we have to review this process and make sure that they are functioning and doing the most high value activities that exist in the state. We talk about reform. If this budget cycle doesn't cause us to look at reform, first part of reform is end-to-end process lifecycle audits of the transactions that are most important to the citizens of the state. Department of Health and Human Services. We don't even know what some of the impacts are to the existing operations. This rededicating or redirecting the resources will help us garner the foundation to allow us as a legislature to make better decisions. And so I'm glad that it originally started that it was, I carried some legislation last year, but I think this is really, the conversation's in the right spot now. And I think what everybody's asking for, and I agree with Representative Liebling and the complexities of the accounting, we can leave that to the geniuses in the room. But I think how we define and where the resources go and whether that requires a separate allocation from the legislative process, I think what we're asking here is everybody look at it, figure out how do we make sure that the legislative auditor resources are applied and put towards the greatest value activities that we have. In order to recreate and put 5 or 6 or 10 additional resources on really high value activities that need to be done would take 5 years if we could even find the people. We have those people in the office today. They're just not being put on useful tasks that utilize their knowledge, skills, and abilities to the greatest extent. So I think what we're asking for everybody is keep an open mind. We're going to have great, healthy debate on this. But I think at the end of the day, this is where the conversation should occur, and that we all agree, because I think it's a really good bipartisan body, that we ultimately end up with what we think is best for the state of Minnesota, the legislature in the process, and the Office of the Legislative Auditor in the tasks in which we need them to focus on. So we don't know what the future looks like, but I agree, and I appreciate everybody's conversation here about how do we, one, I think it's educational for many people of what it really does, what it doesn't do, and what resources it consumes. It's pretty daunting. When you look, I think at the spreadsheet that we have here in front of me, I think I see some 66 staff. So at some point you're telling us, you know, almost 50% of our Office of the Legislative staff is tied up in a single audit activity, something that's pretty mundane and routine, although vital. And we can outsource that. I think we should be looking at those resources to bring in somebody who can do that, bring in competent company to do that. I also don't think that any of us are tied to that this is exclusively on MMB to manage all of it. I think we got to look at how best to manage that activity because it's closely integrated to the work and the fiscal audits that are required of the OLA on an ongoing basis. So I think all those things are important. But I think this is probably one of the greatest exercises that we can perform as a Legislative Audit Commission, setting our future and making sure our resources are again used to the greatest value. So with that, Mr. Chair, I appreciate you allowing me the comments.
Representative Liebling and Representative Erickson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So and thank you, Senator Cran. I think those are great comments, but I think we got a little out of order here because of our technical difficulties. And Mr. Chair, as you were sort of trying to reframe it and bring us back, what I wanted to say is, I don't know if we didn't quite get through talking with MMB because that's a key part of whether we can shift this responsibility is what's going to happen with the funding for it and, whether they can do it. And I don't think we fully got through that. And so, if Mr. Hallstrom has more to say, we've skipped ahead a little bit, I think. And I just wanted to bring us back. And I don't know if Ms. Farrell can get on now, but I do want to have a clear sense of what they're telling us. And I don't really, I thought I heard that it had to come out of the general fund in some way. I'm not sure about that. We've sort of thrown a few things around. I just want to tie that up before we get too far gone on it.
And I think if Commissioner Farrell and Commissioner Hallstrom are both there, if they could prepare to answer that. In addition, timing, we're in a budget process now, and we're in a fiscal year that ends on June 30th, and we'll be preparing for the budget for the next 2 years. So I think timing is also an important question, but Representative Erickson has been waiting, and I want to make sure I get to her. And if the two commissioners can be prepared to answer Representative Liebling's question, but I want to give Representative Erickson the opportunity to ask her question. Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess my question would be, what is done in other states when they have an organization like we do, a Legislative Audit Commission, as far as auditing the federal dollars? Do we have information on that? Does MMB know? I tend to agree with Representative Liebling that we have some unanswered questions here, and I am rather confused at this point. So I would appreciate learning a little bit more about what's done in other states with commissions like we have and what MMB might know. Thank you.
Mr. Nobles, could you reference the sheet in the packet and maybe walk through that?
Mr. Nobles, you're muted.
I was just trying to find that document. Ms. Randall, maybe you can.
Or Ms. Randall, if you can put it up on the screen so that the public can see.
Sure. Mr. Chair, yes, if Ms. Gilb could share the screen and show the table that shows what the other states are doing related to the single audit, that would be helpful. I'm sure she's working on that now. But it is in the packet, Representative Erickson. It's just after Ms. Lyson's resume, and it's a table with 3 columns, and it shows how other states handle the single audit responsibility. And basically, one column shows that in 17 states, the state or a body like ours handles the single audit completely. In 18 states, it is shared between an office like ours or the state and then a CPA. And then in 14 states, I'm not sure why, I think we don't have information on one state. In 14 states, a CPA firm conducts all of the single audit. So that is in your packet. My guess is that Ms. Gill will throw it up on the screen as soon as she is able to.
Thank you.
And Ms. Randall, when you say state or legislative auditor, so that would be a state auditor or a comptroller or an entity. States call them different things, correct?
Mr. Chair, that is correct. It sometimes may also be the state agency like MMB. Actually, Ms. Lyson is probably the expert on this on this call. But my understanding is it would be either a body like ours or a state agency comparable to MMB. And Ms. Lyson is nodding, which makes me think that's at least mostly correct.
Representative Erickson, was that helpful?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to cycle back to the Assistant and Deputy Commissioner to answer Representative Liebling's question, and then we'll, I think this is going to continue to be a discussion at our December meeting, but I want to make sure we're continuing to get information to members. Commissioners.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think to try to capture where we were when Cindy dropped off, I think it would be useful to just walk through a cycle or so to just understand maybe in a little bit better or more precision than I could offer when the dollars hit the funds, because I think this gets to your question about where is the why and where is there a general fund cost to do something that should be largely offset by the federal dollars. Cindy, are you able to hear us?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I apologize for dropping off. Lost complete internet, so I think I'm going to keep my video off.
Yep. Go ahead.
But I believe I was in mid-sentence trying to describe the funding. Proceed. And in a simple example, if the legislative auditor receives $100 to do the single audit, they're performing that audit in 1 year. The following year, those costs are allocated to those state agencies. So those state agencies that did receive their federal funds, if they each receive $100 and they're each billed $10 for the costs of the legislative auditor, that money goes back to the general fund, just at the fund level, same place that tax revenues go into, many license fees go into, that are collected by state agencies, go to the fund itself and not into a specific special revenue account. So moving forward, if MMB were to pay for a third party, we would need an appropriation out of a special revenue account and the authority to bill those agencies directly for the federal funds that they're collecting. That'll leave a gap with what is currently going into the general fund. Does that help?
That does. With a federal fiscal year and a state fiscal year, could you describe, maybe what months we're talking about here? Or is it quarterly, or is it?
The statewide indirect cost allocation is done on an annual basis and submitted to the federal government for approval. And we bill agencies at the beginning of a fiscal year, and they remit the funds to the general fund on a quarterly basis.
Members, does that help answer questions?
Mr. Chair, since closing loop on it, that is really, Ms. Farrell, thank you. That's really a good explanation. Mr. Hallstrom was right. You are absolutely the right person to answer. That's really helpful. So it sounds like, I mean, of course, in this coming, budget, it's going to be really challenging to find any new general fund money. I mean, well, let me back up and just say that I get it now, but it doesn't seem like a really good way to do it. Let's just face it, because there's no real correlation then between what gets appropriated to get the work done and what was put aside, by the, I mean, it depends on like just the goodwill and knowledge of the legislature to appropriate the right money to get the work done. And so it seems like having a special revenue fund and that it may, I guess, if I'm understanding this right, maybe we could avoid a general fund hit by waiting until we get some of those funds coming into a special revenue fund and then making the change. Does that make sense? I mean, also, I want to know if MMB has a position on this too. I mean, you're kind of explaining how it works, but do you have a position in support of our doing this, or are you opposed or neutral, or what exactly is the position?
Commissioner Hallstrom or Commissioner Farrell?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. No, we don't have a position. We've had a good working relationship with the legislative auditor, and this is an arrangement that was established by Memorandum of Understanding in 1983. It doesn't surprise me that we might need to tweak it a little bit to sort of modernize our approach, but there's nothing about the status quo that's deficient from our standpoint. We get high quality work from our colleagues. At one point we were in the same building, so it made us, it's easy to work together. We have some existing systems. Some of that will be lost to transition to a new auditor. But anybody who's does audits and transitions to a new auditor knows there's always there's a learning curve. But it's completely acceptable from MMB's perspective to approach the single audit differently. And so I think really there's maybe some policy judgment or sort of legislative interests that sort of are more relevant to your consideration of this choice than the administrative interests. As long as we feel that we can adequately and competently complete the work that we need to do for purposes of our federal obligations. So if we can do the single audit and have the resources to do that and sort of meet our obligations, it'll work.
I'm pleased to hear there was a memorandum of understanding at one time. 1983 is a long time ago. That era of Cyndi Lauper, Michael Jackson, and Duran Duran is a while ago. So I'm hopeful that we can update where we're at, and if it's at least a memorandum or some action, so we're not still on that tour. Any other questions, members? Senator Friends.
No, I don't have another question, but if we're going to throw around 1980s acts, I just don't want to be left behind. I do appreciate the testimony, Mr. Chair, and I think we've got a good amount of information in front of us. And I think Senator Curran made one of the best points today, which is we need to remember this is going to potentially free up some resources to do some stuff that has not been done by the legislative auditor. And we're all very high on the work of the Office of the Legislative Auditor. So in other words, we're looking at the possibility of getting a lot of great work from an office that's already doing a lot of great work. That's a great thing. I will return offline, Mr. Chair, to Cyndi Lauper and Duran Duran at a more appropriate time. Not today. Thank you.
Members, any other questions? We'll move on then. Thank you, commissioners. Ongoing discussion here that we will continue. We'll move to budget options, which are related. So Mr. Nobles, item number 4 on the agenda, OLA budget options.
I figured out I muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Mr. Chair, discussing, what to propose for OLA in the next biennium is a very challenging situation. Frankly, any talk of who's going to get what appropriated to them to do what in the next biennium is just a very challenging thing, because we don't know exactly how much money is going to be available. And I have always, when I've seen the legislature go through these difficult times, I have not wanted to add to your difficulty and say, oh, I want to be in the line where there are people asking you for more money, for more positions. But on the other hand, as legislative auditor, I see what goes on here every day, and I see the stress that the staff are under, the hours they put in, the challenges they have to meet. And so I feel some responsibility to be an advocate for the OLA budget. But I need your guidance. I know you probably can't give it definitively right now, because there are a lot of unanswered questions for you too, and what the requests are going to be from other agencies as well. So we have approached this, as you requested, as setting forth some options, from anticipating cuts to the status quo to potentially adding 2 people here, 2 people there. We certainly think we could do a lot more work in, for example, the IT auditing area. We have 2 IT auditors to audit all of the IT systems in state government. I think the Department of Human Services alone has around 600 people who work in their IT department. And they need those, because that's an incredibly sensitive, complicated IT system that they run. And MnDOT, DPS, all these other departments, they have very complex, very sensitive IT systems that mean whether or not on any given day, any given hour, the state is going to be able to provide the services that the public needs and demands, and be also keeping all the records that need to be kept. So you have in front of you now on your screen what we lay out as the possibilities. And Ms. Randall may want to add her comments, but we really look today for guidance from you on what you're comfortable with us putting together. And you may need more thought and consideration, and you may want to wait until the next Legislative Audit Commission meeting. That's totally up to you. But we certainly are prepared to discuss what impacts the various options would have. So Ms. Randall, Mr. Chairman, if Ms. Randall wants to add anything to that, I'd be happy to defer to her.
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Nobles. I don't really have anything new to add. I know we've discussed these different options at a couple meetings, and they've been presented to you. I think there's a lot of interplay between the discussion around single audit, the discussion around these different budget options, some of the provisions in the housekeeping bill that's next on the agenda to discuss. And then, of course, just the situation for the state's budget overall. So again, I don't know that we're looking for guidance today, but we definitely will need some from you in the future.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Nobles.
I just want to add one other complexity that we're faced with. And again, as Ms. Randall said, we may need just a whole separate meeting for this discussion. But in addition to our general fund appropriation, which has always been the principal source of our money for our office, over the last 2 biennia, legislators, more at their initiative, frankly, than ours, have given us some mandate and then attached some dedicated money to that. I discussed that in some of the upcoming discussion about our statutes. But we now have a staffing level that depends not only on those monies coming from the general fund, but the continuation of money from some other jurisdictions within the legislature as well, particularly in human services, money that was appropriated to us and dedicated to doing audits of MCOs, managed care organizations, which we think is very important. But again, that we know that money in that area is going to be very tight. Nobody knows that probably more than Representative Liebling. So we will work with the legislature and be as flexible as possible in what we propose. So I just thought I should let you know that there are some complexities beyond just a general fund appropriation. There's some dedicated monies that come from other sources as well.
If the commissioners are still on, could they give us maybe an estimated time for the November, December forecast?
Mr. Chair, I don't know if they have a actual announced date. It's almost always the first week of December. I am just looking at my calendar, so with that, I would need to double check with the team if they've picked a date or a time, but that gives us the best information that we can use from the November time period. It's usually why it happens at that time.
Representative Liebling, your hand is up. Is that a question or is that from?
Yeah, I do have a question, Mr. Chair, and this does not have to be done now, but Mr. Nobles, when you're, and I appreciate getting those options. I think it's really important to lay out what the needs are, even in a year when we know that we may not get to meet the needs. But I wonder if you could find for us or compile information. This is along the lines of what Representative Erickson was asking about before that we have compiled for us. What do other states do about IT audits? Because it seems to me that there's certainly a lot of complexity there, a lot of probably need to have oversight of that. But I wonder, if that's something that is that we are doing it the most efficient way and the way that fits best with the organization. Anyway, I don't want to go into that now, but I just wanted to kind of put the request out there if we could get some information on that as we look at the budget and how we want to prioritize the work of the office. Thank you.
I'll certainly do that.
Mr. Nobles, you had earlier referenced, that we don't do cost recovery. We've got additional cost when auditing dedicated dollars. I don't know if there's, particularly with legacy, but there are other dedicated funds as well, like LCCMR, where by statute, there's administrative costs that are allowable cost up to a certain percentage. So I don't know how much that cost is, but if we are absorbing it, we may want to document it to provide some explicit cost recovery if that is not currently there.
Mr. Chair, we can certainly look at that. One of the challenges that we have raised in our audits of legacy money, as you well know, is that this is constitutionally dedicated money, and there are certain provisions in the constitutional amendment that may restrict OLA from receiving that money because it would potentially be substituting for a traditional source of funding. But and I know, and probably all the rest of you know, that's one of the most complicated issues in state government, and it's so complicated that I think the Office of Legislative Auditor has just stopped raising it with agencies. We raise it, and are we substituting legacy money for traditional forms of funding for those programs? No one has ever been able to come up with the answer to that, but that is something that could inhibit us from charging legacy funds for our work. But again, it's a complicated issue, and we can deal with that potentially in the future.
Commissioner Hallstrom, what is the timeline for the governor's budget? I know things kind of start moving closely here, or quickly here, once we get the forecast, but if the commission was going to make a recommendation, at least from the commission, in terms of a budget option, if we did that in December after the forecast, is that too late for input, or is that still timely?
I mean, so the governor has statutory responsibility to turn his budget proposal in towards the end of January, and that is that's sort of the time that the time period that you're talking about is post forecast through the beginning of session is really that budget construction crunch time. And so to your question, I think that your timing is perfectly reasonable to have something considered for inclusion.
Of course, the legislature is a separate and equal branch of government, and if the commission provided guidance to our peers in the House and the Senate, they would have time before convening and holding hearings. Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Worth pointing out, of course, that there's some question whether the federal government will make a decision on stimulus that might affect the state budget in December. While that's not a certainty that they'll do that, it's not a certainty they won't, and that information would be critical if we're trying to decide between the OLA tranches, if you will, of status quo or 5% back. And so hopefully as we revisit that topic, maybe we'll get a little inkle from our friends in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Members, I'd like to move to the fifth item, the housekeeping bill, if possible, so we can wrap up before 3 o'clock. Mr. Nobles.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And you have a document in front of you that I sent to you today, and I do apologize that I wasn't able to get this to you sooner because there are some pretty complicated issues involved in what we're proposing. There frankly are some that are probably pretty simple, and because of the limitation of time, let me quickly mention the ones that I think are simple. And again, whether you can take action on those or any of these today, it can wait for a next meeting. But I think we would like to use this opportunity just to lay out some of the things that we think need to be considered in terms of changing the law that governs the Office of Legislative Auditor. One that I think is pretty simple, and that is we'd just like to change the name of the 3 people in this office who are currently called in law confidential secretaries. That's the way it was set up originally in 1973. I think that name simply doesn't reflect the responsibilities of these folks. They, I have under the law a confidential secretary, and she does a great job, but she doesn't work just for me. She does a wide range of office function, including HR and a lot of other things. So that would be a simple one. The next one is the really complicated one. And this is probably gonna, and I hope it will, really stimulate quite a bit of discussion. Now, it's complicated. So let me start by saying when this office was created, it was the public examiner, an appointee of the governor, who was actually the auditor of state and local government, not the state auditor. And so the legislature made a decision to break the public examiner's office kind of in two and transfer the employees to do audit work into the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and some of them went over to the state auditor's office to do local auditing. And they were at that time, and the legislature decided to maintain them in the classified civil service. So unlike every other legislative office, the Office of the Legislative Auditor, for all of the employees except the two deputies, myself, and our now called confidential secretaries, are in the classified civil service. And there's some benefit and advantage to that because there's some protection, and I think that they feel more comfortable with that than being at-will employees. We've come across one complication, however. There is a law in statute that is 43A.32, which gives classified civil servants in state government the opportunity to take a leave of absence to run for a political office. And in fact, there's a provision in that section of law that says the employer must provide a leave of absence if that person asked for it, or cannot require that employee to take a leave of absence. So again, it leaves it up to the employee who maybe wants to run for a political office or manage a campaign. That employee can come to me and say, I want to take a leave to do that, and I have to provide it. Alternatively, if I find out that an employee is going to run for a political office, I might go to that employee and say, I'm not comfortable with that. I think you, at a minimum, have to take a leave from working here. And they could say no. The law allows me to run for the political office. So we think that's incompatible with our position in the legislative branch as a nonpartisan office. We went many years where this was never really a concern. But this year, earlier, some months ago, I had one of our auditors come to me and say, I want to run for a political office. In fact, he told me he was going to run for the Minnesota Senate, a position in the Minnesota Senate. Now, immediately, that causes concern, because once any one of you finds out that an OLA employee working here as a nonpartisan employee is going to be running for a political office, indeed for an office in the Minnesota legislature, in the Minnesota Senate, and is going to run on a partisan ticket, that I think we would all agree is really not compatible with the way we need to operate. That would certainly put a question mark over, I think, not only that individual, but this office, to allow somebody to do that. So right now, with that employee, my hands were tied. Luckily, he saw that it was incompatible and he resigned. But he had other options under the law. And I'm asking you to change that and exempt OLA classified employees from the options that are available under 43A.32. Now, I want to say just another word, because this issue about participating in political activities has come up in another way as well. When the legislature changed the presidential primary so that there would potentially be identification of individuals and which party which candidate and which party they voted for, that information could have become available to the officials in those parties. I was very uncomfortable with that. And we had a staff meeting, and frankly, I asked staff if they would refrain from participating. And there was not full agreement on that. And so we're trying to balance people's constitutional right to vote, and their right to participate in politics in some way. And striking that balance has been very difficult. And so in addition, I would like you to authorize the legislative auditor to set up a code of conduct that we could point to that would address things like, is it okay for somebody to come to work wearing a piece of clothing, a hat, a t-shirt, or whatever, that clearly identifies a political preference? Even more complicated is, what can we do about people participating in certain advocacy activities that you, as people in the political arena, would consider indicating a political preference? So I come to you with this because you are the experts on politics. And as you have said, having a nonpartisan office in the legislative branch is extremely important and valuable to you. And as you know, we have to protect that, not only in reality, but in perception. And so this is an issue that I need you to discuss, and for, I hope, you to give us some guidance and some change in the law so that I do not, or the next legislative auditor does not face the very difficult decision with an employee who comes to him or her and says, I want to run for a seat in the Minnesota Senate or a county commission. You know, it was particularly striking that the person wanted to run for an office in the Minnesota legislature. So I would ask you, any one of you, whether Democrat or Republican, if you pick up the paper and you learn that the opponent who is announced in your district is an employee at the office of the legislative auditor, how would you feel? And you would probably, I assume, make a phone call to me and say, Jim, what are you going to do about this? Well, I'll let you speak for yourselves, but I would anticipate that phone call if we have somebody on this staff who runs against one of you. So there you are, Mr. Chairman. Another complicated issue for you to address.
Mr. Nobles, if you could go to number 3, number 4, number 5, maybe you could just go through them, because.
And then we could just come back. Yes, Mr. Chairman, the others are much simpler. The legislature created in 1917 a law, 2017, a law that required us to audit the Metropolitan Transit financial activities. You repealed that law in 2019, but you left a provision that requires the legislative auditor to appoint a fiscal oversight officer to conduct those audits. We just think that ought to be taken out of the statute. It's no longer needed. It's really irrelevant. There is also a provision, and this has actually been discussed by the commission before, a provision in law that requires the legislative auditor to make audits at the Department of Human Services a priority. And that's fine. We would do that anyway. So that expression of legislative direction is, we don't object to. But if you look at the language, and you do have a set of the statutes in your packet, but again, I didn't want to go through too much detail, but there are provisions in that section that then detail in great detail the timing and methodology of those audits. We don't think that should be in law. We think that those details should really be left for the discretion and judgment of the professional in the office of the legislative auditor. Number 5, we would like to condition the mandate that is currently in law that we audit managed care organizations. We would like to condition that, as we do a number of legislative mandates for audits, on the availability of funds. And another thing we'll probably need to come back to in our discussion about the budget. So again, we're not proposing to stop doing those. We're just proposing that there be some conditionality that the funds are actually available. We would then ask for a similar elimination, actually even a complete elimination of the mandate that we audit the Department of Transportation. Again, we have that jurisdiction. We go there very frequently. There's also a mandate that we audit the Department of Public Safety. Really unnecessary. We do that anyway. This one's just a little bit more complicated, and maybe we can leave it for another time. But as you know, the legislative auditor has very strong authority in statute to see all government data and documents regardless of classification. And we really need that. But we've had several entities say, well, that law says that you may need that data or those documents for that audit. Well, we don't think you do. And so we think we're part of the decision-making process to determine whether or not we will give you that data or those documents. We think that needs to be clarified, that really for the independence and the integrity of our work, that's a judgment that needs to be made by the legislative auditor. And then there is the provision that we've already discussed, Mr. Chairman, about the single audit shift. And then those are the ones we are proposing, but there's some others that we may want to get to later to discuss. And they relate to the fact that we are subject to the Government Data Practices Act. That means people can make requests to see all of the documents and data in the Office of the Legislative Auditor. A great deal of those documents and that data are very sensitive, not public data and documents. And when we have to respond to those requests, it's enormously complicated and time consuming. And so we'd like to discuss what solutions we might have for that. And then I know that there's been discussion among members of the commission about the possibility of more explicitly acknowledging and recognizing the fact that OLA does what we call special reviews. We currently exercise that authority under our more general authority to audit and investigate. But we think the term special review is a more accurate term for some of that work. And again, we would just like a recognition in law for that term. But that may lead us into a deeper discussion about those special reviews. What do we decide to do? What are our criteria and that sort of thing? So those are what we're proposing for your consideration, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Klein.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Just to comment on the initial and the political proposition that you made, Mr. Nobles, I think you spoke very well to that point, and I agree that we need to create some sort of guardrails around political activity by employees in the Legislative Auditor's office. What I was concerned about was, constitutional challenges to that, whether we try to implement that by your rulemaking or by our legislative action. It seems to me that we would run into some First Amendment concerns if an individual chose to challenge that policy. But you say that there's precedent for that in other neutral government agencies. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, Mr. Chairman and Senator. When we were considering the situation we found ourselves in, we did ask House Research and Council, the Revisor's Office, other nonpartisan offices in the legislative branch, what they were doing about restricting political activity of their employees, specifically related to the presidential primary, but for other things as well. House Research, Senate Council, other nonpartisan staff all said, we have informal understandings among staff that they need to restrict their political activity. Now, there's a wide range of what that could include. And, I had those discussions with the leadership in Senate Council and House Research about a wide range of possibilities where they might feel they had to intervene. And this does get, as you say, very sensitive about people's constitutional rights. For example, if a member of Senate Council pulls up in the Senate parking lot with a bumper sticker identifying a political leaning, are you going to be comfortable with that Senate Council person working for you? So, everybody tries to manage and balance this issue delicately and usually preferably informally. But because of that law that I referred to, we have to be more, I think we need to be more explicit in in at least exempting OLA classified employees from that option. I don't know that, frankly, there is a constitutional right for somebody to be in a nonpartisan position in the legislature or the executive branch, but specifically in the legislative branch, and then run for a political office. But, you know, we will certainly do a lot of legal research on that. Case law, we've already done some of that. I will add that when I was talking to my colleagues about this issue, the one thing that did surprise me is that the revisor has an explicit provision in the revisor's law in Chapter 3 that says staff working for the legislative, for the revisor statutes are prohibited from engaging in political activities. And it does not define what those activities are. And so it could be putting a bumper sticker on your car, putting a sign on your lawn. It could be running for a political office. It could be managing a political campaign. It's not defined. And again, the revisor told me that he and previous revisors have simply tried to work with staff to come to an understanding that it's incompatible to work at the revisor of statutes office and be held as nonpartisan by both sides of the aisle in drafting legislation and providing revisor statute with confidential information, and then having them participate in politics. So, but Senator Klein, you're right. There are potential challenges to this. The first thing I ask, oddly enough, the revisor of statute, when he told me of that provision, I said, "Is that constitutional?" And he said, "It is, as long as it's not." And it's not been challenged. So, but could a challenge be made? Absolutely.
Senator Klein, did you have a follow-up? Representative Liebling.
Well, thank you. And this is definitely a delicate and thorny issue. But the thing that strikes me, I was really glad that Senator Klein said that. I think, first of all, we need to get some legal opinion about this. And the fact that the revisor's office does it that way, we've seen similar kinds of things overturned in the past. So I don't think that gives us that much comfort. But my main point, though, is I think it may also, we have to be very careful about what it means to not participate in political activity, you know, because I would say that going to vote in a primary, that's somebody's right to vote. So I don't see that that is something that you could tell your employee, don't vote, you know, even though I recognize the sensitivity there, right?
And Madam and Mr. Chair and
yeah.
Representative Liebling, I just want to be clear. I did not tell our employees.
No, and I'm not saying you did. I'm just saying as we structure a statute.
Yeah, absolutely. And
but let me finish though. But the other piece is, I think it matters what job people are in. So I think the key to this, just my gut reaction is that the key to this is to be very tailored and focused about who's covered and what they're covered for. Mm-hmm. So if somebody is managing the office and never appears in public and is not the face of the office, I think that's very different. Or somebody does auditing work. I mean, I'm not sure about these things, but you know, somebody who's doing work that is really not subject to bias, that follows a standard that is pretty clear cut. I think you'd be less worried about them having a bumper on their bumper sticker than you would about yourself, right, or one of the deputies being right, known to have a political persuasion when you're directing policy of the office. So there may be a little, you know, we're going to have to work our way through this. And also as members, you know, it's nice to not know and have everybody focused on their work. But I think we also understand as political people ourselves that many people, you know, you can't just say to somebody, don't have political feelings and they go away. I mean, right, that's part of people's being often, or other people are just naturally non-political. I mean, we certainly all know such people. So I think we got to figure it out by what positions, and then very carefully by what we mean by political activity for the people in those positions.
Mr. Chair, Representative Liebling, I agree completely. I think I have to uphold probably a different standard than the staff that make sure our IT system is running. So you're absolutely right. And that is why I have always decided, since becoming a legislative auditor, since I worked at House Research, that I wouldn't have lawn signs, bumper stickers. And in fact, I've taken it so far as my wife and I have an agreement that she does not put bumper stickers on her car, but because every once in a while I have to borrow her car. And if you saw me driving it, I don't know, Representative Liebling, with a Make America Great Again, you might have some concern. So no bumper stickers anywhere around our house or lawn signs. But yes, should everybody in the office have to meet that standard? No. But deputies and people who appear before you, Valerie Bombach, who has appeared before your committee and you know very well. So it has to be tailored, and it has to obviously be within constitutional restraint. So I raise this knowing that I don't have all the answers, and I will really look to you, all of you, for your guidance on how we craft this.
We have a couple more questions. It does look, you've got several proposals in here that some seem to be fairly boilerplate. Some are going to require a lot more detailing. So Senator Rest and then Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just continue the line of thought of Representative Liebling. I think she's made some extremely important points and raised some very important questions. And it is indeed, in my mind, the responsibility, if indeed it is constitutional, for us to define what those political activities are that would taint a person's position relative to how they function as an employee of the legislature. And just, how far we would take it. Would you take it to, it would be considered a violation, signing a petition against racism. I mean, that is a political activity. It's a social justice activity, perhaps. And would we frown on anyone signing that kind of petition? And yet it seems to me we have to be very careful about not coming up with a laundry list of you can do this, but you can't do that, and whatever. And I would be very I would side with it, just like in other kinds of like campaign finance law. I would side with transparency more than you can do this or you can't do that, but that someone would be required to be transparent in saying, yes, I voted. I mean, that sounds a little bit ridiculous, but yes, I did this, or I am doing this. And with regard to the presidential primary, we have the means to cure that in terms of protecting the privacy of all voters, not just members of the legislature's staff and or reporters, for that matter, and judges who did not want to do that. We heard from all kinds of people who wanted their privacy protected. We did not accomplish that in 2020, but it doesn't keep us from doing that in the future before we have another presidential primary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to go to Senator Friends and then Representative Kwan.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Nobles, the fact that you pay such attention to the appearance of impropriety is why you are such a great legislative auditor, and I want to thank you for that. I just happen to have my law school constitutional law book here. I'm looking for John Doe versus Nobles. It's not in here, but I would draw attention to the fact that it has an element also of if you are going to set standards, which I think are appropriate, you're going to affect potentially the applicant pool coming in. So there is our desire to continue to see outstanding people come to the office of the legislative auditor. That's what we have right now. There comes a point in which the restrictions you might place on incoming employees cause Minnesotans who might otherwise have applied to say, well, I didn't know I couldn't have a bumper sticker.
Mr. Chairman.
Out that there's another side to it too, which is you want the applicant pool to find those restrictions appropriate. I'm just going to put this back on the shelf with my other law school books. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Nobles, are we running out of time allotted or?
That's kind of up to how, well, Ms. Randall, are we running out of time?
Mr. Chair and members, I think we can go as long as you all want to, but I think there will be a natural end.
I mean, I will be very brief. I just think it's important that I respond to what Senator Franz said, and that is absolutely true and a concern. I mean, when we talk to our staff about potentially, having a policy, we didn't do it, about voting in the presidential primary, I had people in the staff meeting say, I will not work for an employer who would restrict me from voting in the presidential primary. And I understand that voting is a sacred right in this country. And so it's just a very difficult situation. I just want to add a couple of other quick things. One, restricting or having some policy about political activity is not the only issue we deal with in maintaining our independence. And we do tell employees or potential employees, applicants, that there potentially could be some restrictions on their activities and their work assignments. For example, I always tell people, if you are very actively involved in an advocacy group, let's say you are very active in the Sierra Club, which is a great thing for you to do. You're free to do it. But if we have an audit related to the Department of Natural Resources, where the department is in a lawsuit with the Sierra Club, you can't work on that audit because you wouldn't be independent. So, and we know that we could restrict people in working on audits of a political office, for example. If somebody said, boy, I was strongly in favor of the opponent to the current governor, and I was even made contributions, I had lawn signs, everybody knows that. Well, then you're not going to work on the next audit of the governor's office. So we have very targeted and strategic ways of dealing with those kinds of independence impairments. The political issue, frankly, is a little bit different because it's the perception that you as legislators have of this office and the people who work here. That's what concerns us. And that's why we need your guidance. And I think you're providing us with some good guidance, and we will continue to solicit that and listen and move forward with that. So,
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would think the Hatch Act is probably the one that's had the most scrutiny and is still around. I think it's quite appropriate that if you're going to do in a very short list, run as a candidate, chair a committee, et cetera, that you would be required to take a leave of absence. But recent court decisions defining that Second Amendment, First Amendment, if you wear a shirt or a hat that supports those, is not political speech. That was a Supreme Court decision very recently. So I think we've got enough good indicators to put some bounds on it and define it. But I definitely think that if you're going to run for a political office that's partisan, mayor, city council, not there, but that you would then be taking a leave of absence from certain functions within the legislative auditor. So I like the idea. I think that we have more flexibility because of I mean, under the Hatch Act, you can participate politically, but not raise funds and, you know, other constraints. So I'd like to see a more defined, hashed out thing, but I think it would be appropriate to move forward on some type of activity.
Thank you.
I think members, if, you know, as we move towards a legislative session and under COVID restrictions, it's going to be hard to get things drafted, and there will be a crescendo of activity as we move towards January and through the session. So I would ask Mr. Nobles and staff to work on a very preliminary draft for the next meeting in December, which we would have after the forecast. I would also ask, you know, this could maybe be broken up into several bills, because there could be technical corrections like the confidential secretary language that might move very quickly, and there's others that may have to go to several committees. So by getting the very preliminary draft ready, I would also ask you to look and see if there's anything that would need to be changed reflecting a state of emergency or something that's COVID related. If we have anything that provides for adjustment of work plans or some type of boilerplate language that we just didn't anticipate a year ago, that might be helpful to give some discretion to operate. And then also even budgeting, what happens when people aren't in the office, and normal activities that occur in the office, and those expenses of new computers, rent, those type of things. So I would ask you to look if there's anything that is COVID type of emergency related that we need to have. Maybe it's also providing the safety equipment or something like that. So I don't know if that's needed in statute, but it might be something to consider that we just haven't considered before.
I will certainly do that, Mr. Chairman, and I do appreciate your suggestion that we break this into maybe some parts, because some clearly are not going to be controversial. They're more within the housekeeping, but there are others like the political issue that we've just discussed. Also taking OLA potentially out of the Government Data Practices Act, that would be extremely controversial. So I will start the draft and separate some of these from the controversial from the non-controversial.
And members, we're about to wrap up here, but if you do have input and comment, I would encourage you to contact Mr. Nobles or Ms. Randall or Ms. Lyson as we move forward here to get your input into that. Members, are there any other items of business or concerns we need to address today? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.